Aloha and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Got Your Six podcast. This six-question podcast brings together high performers to share their methods, strategies, and ideas, delivered in an informative and, most importantly, actionable way that'll help you lead yourself and those around you from the battlefield to the boardroom. Coming to you every episode, I'm your host, Tony Nash. And into the breach.
Nothing mentioned on this podcast is an endorsement or opinion of the Department of Defense.
I got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. I got your six.
Sixers, again, so stoked to have Janell here. We're going to dive into a lot of different things, both from her time through the Naval Academy, as we mentioned. It's just going to be incredible. Janell, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
That's awesome. So you're still continuing to use what you take away from your time in the Marines, and what you learned at the Naval Academy. But really, is there something like you kind of continue to implement every day now that you're doing both the civilian role, being a reservist, an active duty spouse? Like that's a lot to manage. What do you kind of take away from your time so far in the military?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think that the one thing that really is part of my daily life is that sense of personal accountability. And, when you're a military officer, regardless of what branch or what your specialty is, you're responsible for your actions, the actions of your team, and anything that does or doesn't happen. And so I think taking that sense of ownership in my personal and professional life has really helped me stay focused and be deliberate and intentional about how I spend my time. Just kind of even how you were mentioning in the intro, like just prioritizing your time and taking that sense of responsibility that whether something happens or doesn't happen in my life, like I have a say in how that happens. And then keeping myself honest through things like using a planner. Like, at the Naval Academy, it was my I'll find out pad. If you didn't write it down, I didn't remember it. And now I use a planner pretty much every day, every week to help me plan out my daily goals, weekly goals, monthly, and reflect on where I'm at. And so that I think helps keep me honest and on track.
What specifically do you use to kind of like check yourself so you don't get too far off in one direction of like not being able to hold yourself accountable?
I think it's just making sure that I take the time to open up that planner or journal on a regular basis. I actually have a pretty good one that is pretty well structured to say like what I want to do this week, things I'm looking for over the next 3 months. And then it's just taking that time to reflect on a previous month, kind of look ahead to the next one. And sometimes, life doesn't always go according to plan, but I think if you are taking the time to think ahead and focusing on like, am I doing the things today that are going to help get me closer to those goals? Or am I, sitting here binge watching a show that is wasting my time? We all have the same amount of time in a day. It's just how do we choose to use it?
So where, like you talked about, that time is almost like non-negotiable. How much time would you say that is daily?
Maybe 15, 20 minutes at the end of the day usually. And then as I approach the end of a month, maybe a little bit more. But yeah, I don't think it takes a lot of time. It's just like that small habit built over multiple repetitions.
So you bring up habits, which is really interesting. So as you've transitioned, because you got out 2018?
Oh, no, 2020.
20, excuse me, sorry. From active service. So you kind of had to build new habits, especially in the last, year during a pandemic, a lot's going on.
For sure.
What kind of like new belief or behavior has really drastically improved your life?
So I think there's a few things here that come to mind. And I'd like to start with some of the ones that I think are most practical and applicable to anyone. And so it really comes back to time. So for me, going from daily commute to the military office, to the military base, going to my office on base, that was structure and routine in my day. When I went to, now I'm remote job hunting during COVID, how am I going to keep structure in my week and really maximize the time that I have? And so, a couple things that I think helped me a lot were setting screen time limits for apps on my phone. And that's something that anybody can do. Like, think of where are my time sinks throughout the day that I'm just like, am I spending too much time on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook? Maybe there's a learning app or a learning game that you love, but if you're spending more than like an hour or an hour and a half on that thing, maybe that's time that could be spent somewhere else. And so kind of taking that personal inventory, going back to, ownership and responsibility. Hey, if I manage my time, if I'm driving where I want to go next, how do I build these little checks into my day to keep me on track? And so like I get my screen going black that says, you spent too much time on, LinkedIn today, or you spent too much time on wherever. And you can override that if you have something deliberate that you need to do. But that's one example of like kind of those curbs to help keep you on track and going in the right direction. And then, a couple other things that I'd say have really improved my life. And with that would be like structures that, or not structures, but like small habits that help me keep my mental health on track as well. And two small things there is like, one of my bad habits previously was, pretty much every day, like coming home from work, having a beer or two. Switching that out and just switching that from like every day grab a beer, every day grab a can of sparkling water. Like for me, it was just that habit of, I like having something cold and bubbly at the end of the day, and it didn't need to be alcohol. So that's really improved my life. And then another one is like changing how much caffeine I was taking in the morning. And like, I love coffee, so I couldn't quit coffee. I just switched to, I cut back to 50-50, half decaf, half regular. And like, those are things that kind of helped keep my mental state more steady throughout the day. And then some of those other kind of curbs that I put in place to help keep me on track, stay focused through a new routine and a life change.
So it's those constant recalibrations, like you said, whether it's looking at your screen time or understanding like, hey, this is too much alcohol, but what it really comes down to is I need some sort of like hard break, some sort of physical like feeling I know I'm going to hit. And I like how you kind of change that from a cold beer to a cold, bubbly water. What's your flavor?
I like mixing it up,
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Something different every week usually.
Yeah. Nice. No, that's very interesting. So was that kind of like a self-taught thing, or did you kind of pull that from sort of like a book, or was that like, where did that influence come from?
So some of those steps, especially some of those like physical changes that I was making, were really based out of some of the like personal learning that I had to do after I hit like a mental health breaking point. And so I've talked about that in some other things that I've shared before. But really it came down to like, when I first went to get help, I thought something was medically wrong with me because I was having nonstop headaches and lots of other things that were going on that just didn't seem to fit with like, why am I feeling this way? I feel so off all the time. Why is my head hurting? Why isn't it stopping? And, after we kept going down the line and like nothing was medically, there were no underlying medical problems, just stress and not knowing how to really deal with mental health in a way to reduce the stress in my life. Like I knew how to build up a wall and push through, but I didn't know how to actually like let it flow out of me and like be able to continue on with my day throughout, that stuff. And so those were some of those kind of like physical tools that were taught in one of the courses that I went to that really like, I sat there and I was like, this sounds dumb, but if I try it and it works, then I'm going to keep doing it. And so that, those were just a couple of examples of some of those things.
What was that course, if you don't mind me asking?
So it was called a CBT skills group, and it was the cognitive behavioral therapy skills group, a group class on base. That was, I'm really grateful. I actually had the command support to attend while I was active duty. And I self-referred to this course that normally, is something that people are directed to go to following like substance abuse or suicidal ideations or attempts, in a way to help get them back on track to like functioning again. And I think that was just a gold mine. Like there were so many things that I didn't learn at the Naval Academy. I didn't learn in SEER school. I didn't learn throughout how many leadership courses do we go to as military officers? And like all of these things, like I had never learned before. And so, after finishing the course, I was just like, as much as I didn't want to talk about this experience, now I realize like life is hard and challenging for everyone, whether it's combat, whether it's family, whether it's personal. And if we don't talk about some of those tough times or some of the tools that we use to get through, we're not being the lifeline to our buddies to our right and left to like help them get through the tough time. And so I kind of got like this kick in the pants, like, hey, you got to talk about this. And even if it's uncomfortable, because you never know who might need to hear it. And we all know folks that aren't here anymore because they never learned some of this stuff. And, if I can help one person ask for help, then it was a win.
No, absolutely. Right. Just being able to kind of be vulnerable to a point of, it's not all about, I've learned so much more from like failure than I have from success, right? Because the failures lead to success. And you've talked, you've already kind of touched on one, right? The mental health kind of breakdown, which that video you did with Google was incredibly powerful. Just kind of talking about, it came to, exactly where you were, what was going on in that moment. And if you want to kind of share a little bit about that, I think that would be extremely beneficial.
It's going back to that day. It felt like a crash and burn for me. I'm sitting there trying to talk to some folks that I worked with. I was a company commander at the time, so there was, a lot of responsibility, and I'm sitting there trying to just go through kind of an end of day brief with some of my staff. And, pretty much like the day had started off weird, like super bad stress dreams that were, just like, what's going on? And then, this thing happens in the afternoon where my head's hurting. I can't see, I can't read my notebook. I can't spit out the words that I'm trying to say. And like, you're aware that other people around you are kind of looking at you funny because you're like, what is she saying? Like, what? This makes no sense. And so I had to like excuse myself, like step to the side, burst into tears, like, what's going on? And some people were like, oh, hey, you just need to take a day off. Like, you just need a little bit of a break. But then, when I got home that night, my neighbor asked me how I was doing. And, there's a lot of overlap in our life. Like, I don't want to get into exactly who he is, but, a lot of similarities in his education and career path. So when he asked me how I was doing, I felt that I could answer honestly. But in that sense, like, I just started crying and I was like uncontrollable. And so we just started game planning right there. Like, hey, do you need to stay home? Do you need to go to medical tomorrow? I'm like, I don't know what am I going to do when I show up at medical? Like, what's wrong? I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't want to walk in to base medical and just be this, like, I had this weird thing happen to me. I don't know what to do. They're like, well, do you want to go to a different office on base? Like, my wife could take you to the ER tonight. And that was when it was like, that just felt like the right answer. Like, I wasn't in a sense where I could stay home and take care of my son that night. Like, I needed more help than I realized. And And so, at that point I still thought like, do I have a brain tumor or something? Like, why is my head hurt so bad? Why is this going on? And so, it still took a couple weeks for me to really unpack like all the different things that we were looking into. And then eventually it was just recognizing like, hey, you got a lot going on. You've never really learned you've only learned how to push through. That's what the academy taught us. That's what these other things taught us. Like there's tools, there's breathing tools, there's physical tools, there's emotional, there's social, psychological, like eventually, like when I went to the course was like 2 months later from when that first night happened. And it was like things kept happening after that, like where I was like still breaking down at work, still not able to like hold it together. And so it was just like clear that it wasn't just something that I could take a day off and go back and be normal. It was like, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like an earthquake, right? Like you had that initial shock wave, and then there's always like those like tremors that'll continue to like kind of spread out as time goes on until obviously can't really fix plate shifting, but like to kind of just, that's what it sounds like you're describing is, but to be able to be like, this is much more deeper than what it is on the surface, and it needs to be addressed for long-term health. Not only for myself, but everybody else who depend on me and I depend on them. That's extremely powerful.
Yeah, that's actually, I don't think I've ever quite heard it with that analogy before, but I think that was a perfect analogy. And I think because it also, that's how it builds up. Like, how does an earthquake start? You've got pressure building and building and building, and then it breaks, and then there's aftershocks. And so I think that's a great analogy.
So I wouldn't define that as like a failure, but you mentioned like that crash and burn, but look what it's been able to kind of like lead to in terms of success for you long-term, right? Because you have these tools, not only that you use, but you can share with other people. So it's not like, as a coach, right? A coach is effective when they understand their athlete, as opposed to just be like, hey, we're running 4-3 defense, block and tackle, block and tackle, block and tackle.
Yeah, I think what really drove me to get help and continue to get help was, my husband was getting ready to deploy, and I knew that if I was going to still be active duty as a mom, like I needed to be strong to get through my husband being gone. That was like the driving factor for me. And then, looking back, then COVID happened while my husband was deployed. And so like, that's why I kind of look back and say, I'm grateful for the timing, because I think so many people that situation that I just described, they faced that during COVID, regardless of what your family or work situation was. Everybody that I know like can talk to this sense of feeling overwhelmed, not knowing what to do, so much uncertainty. And so it really speaks to that, like that sense of like, this isn't something that's just isolated to military veterans. But I think especially a lot of moms feel it when there's just so much thrown at us, and we power through it, but we can also do a lot to help support each other through it as well.
Yeah, it's not a service member problem. It's a person problem. We're all humans at the end of the day, and we're like you said, I think you said it beautifully. Like, life is hard, but understanding that it is hard, but we can start to build and understand as we look. We have to look at internally in order to move forward and adjust, so that hardness helps to catalyze, or I don't know, helps growth. And my words are not there because I'm just like, this is a lot in terms of like, this is awesome that you're being able to share this. So now that, kind of fast forward a little bit to now, you have all these skill sets and tools that you've learned. Is there one particular one that you're trying to implement more than others, or like working really hard to like use daily?
One that comes to mind here is really trying to be kind and patient to those that I'm around the most. I think sometimes it's easy to put on a persona when you go off somewhere, like going to work or going to your office. But, you know, I've been working from home so far. And so for me, like the people that I'm around the most are my spouse and my son. And if I'm not being kind and patient to them, you know, I really see it in my son. And so I realized like I need to model that behavior, but like authentically, not fake, you know, because kids see through that. And really just being able to like have a conversation when you're frustrated, talk something through if you're not understanding, and really being patient, you know, because there's been so much life change. Like my family just PCS, you know, so like new home, new job, getting through COVID, so many changes as guidelines change and things like that. So it's like trying to be that sense of calm, which I can only do by like really having that sense throughout the day of like keeping myself centered and then being able to be kind and patient with those around me. And so I think that's one of the things I'm still working on, because it's hard, you know, you can't, it's hard to be, it's hard to, it takes work to really treat those around you with a lot of love, especially when things are frustrating or stressful.
Right. And again, it requires you to look in and be like, why am I reacting or having this understanding of this situation in this specific way? And it forces you to really strengthen like that emotional intelligence muscle, because it like the 4 whys, right? They do that a lot in like startups and stuff like that, where it's like why until we get to like the base root of the problem. And that's what you need to do. Like, but the more reps you do, the quicker you get at really understanding why you might think it's like A, it's really like D is the reason I'm reacting this way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we're like just so much growth, right? Not only that you've experienced during COVID, but like leading up through COVID, now doing what you're doing. How would you say you're better than yesterday?
This was one of, I think, my favorite questions when I was preparing. And I really think that the way that I'm better than yesterday is that I'm judging my personal and professional success on my own terms and my own timeline. And I think that was one of the struggles that I had being active duty, was that there's always this external measure of what success in your job or your rank looks like. And I think that works for a lot of people. But for me, you know, I really wanted to have more flexibility to do different things. And so feeling like I'm competing against myself, or I'm competing against like who I was yesterday, helps me like focus my time and efforts to say yes and no to the organizations and activities that really like speak to my soul or align with my future vision of what success looks like. And so I think that, you know, if you look at my bio, you might think like, well, she's all over the place. Like, what is she doing? And it's like, hey, all of these things are part of like where I see me being the happiest 30 years from now. And I don't necessarily know where all these things lead, but like one of the lessons I've learned in life is if you want to be a part of something, just show up. You might not know how you can contribute. You might not see that there's a place for you with your name on it or your skill set on it. But if you care about an organization or an event and you want to help them, you know, you might be surprised like how much you can contribute just by showing up. And so, you know, that's,
Just being at the table is extremely powerful. I 100% agree with you. And like you said, it doesn't need to, there's no cookie cutter of like, oh, why this, you know, you're all over the place. Like that's you, that's who you are. That's what you're about. Right. And that knowing that allows you to be so much more effective professionally, personally, you know, you name it. Right.
Mm-hmm. And Yeah, and this kind of ties in with one of your other questions, but I think it fits here because we're talking about it. I think it's really easy to underestimate the value and impact of 30 to 60 minutes of your time compounded over weeks and months. And whether that's towards a personal endeavor or helping out an organization, like even if you're on a Zoom call once a month for a nonprofit, like you don't necessarily know some of the skills and experiences you have that can bring value to something that they're planning. Or like with Beyond the Uniform, like it doesn't take me tons of time to help prep social media posts every week, but it's a way that I can give back. It's a way that I can force myself to listen to great interviews with great people and learn from that. But then it's also hands-on learning. And I think we put a lot of emphasis on, hey, go watch a YouTube video, go take a LinkedIn learning course, go take a formal course. Like so many orgs you can learn through hands-on for free just by volunteering. And so I think that's another thing that I would hope people walk away from this interview with, like, you know, what's something that you care about that you've thought, you know, when I'm retired or when I'm out of the military, I'll spend more time with that. And I would challenge you, take the 30 minutes a week or month and build that now. Like you're giving up a video game, you're giving up maybe a Netflix episode, but what you can contribute might be, you know, huge impact to that organization.
Absolutely. Don't self-select your future self. If it means something to you, I mean, it doesn't need to be everything, but at least start with one and continue to just show up for them and yourself. And you'll, you know, like you said, you'll be surprised what you learned.
For sure.
Janell, thank you so much for your time. Where, if people want to reach out, because I know I can already see, you know, DMs are going to start exploding after this episode drops. Where are people going to connect with you?
The number one place to connect with me is LinkedIn message. I do have, you know, I'm on all the social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. I have janellhanf.com, which has some of my previous like podcast episodes and things that I've done. But really, I think like if you want to connect with me, like start there. And like most of my Instagram is like deep end fitness, UTL stuff. Like I post that stuff on Instagram because it's not like super heartfelt for me to like post about my workouts. So if you want something that's a little more like serious, that's why I say like you can message me on Instagram too. Like I'll respond, but I'd say like for more of that like mental health, like heartfelt discussion, I'm more in that mindset with a more professional platform on LinkedIn.
Awesome. And Don Tran, friend of the show, great guest. Again, it's good people continue to coming together. Prime Hall, another great dude. What they're doing over at Deep End Fitness is absolutely incredible. And I'm glad you're part of that organization. Janell, thank you again so much for your time. Being authentic, right? Just allowing us to kind of deep dive into where you've been, what you've gone through, and sharing that with us so we can be better tomorrow. And of course, thank you for having our 6.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the time today.
I don't know what you've been told, Sixers, but the lawyers would like us to remind you that the views, opinions, and comments expressed on the Got Your 6 podcast are solely those of the hosts or guests, to include current and previous Department of Defense employees, and should in no way be considered the opinions of or endorsements on behalf of the Department of Defense or any of its components, divisions, contractors, or other current and previous staff members.